A cat steps slowly across the control panel of a decommissioned nuclear silo. Around it, a crumbling city, once a monument to human civilization. The text flashes, "They thought they ruled the earth." In a neon-lit alley, a woman in stage makeup stands breathless over a dead body. In the mirror behind her, another version of herself watches in horror. Text, "But what if the cycle never ends?" A bowl of yogurt glows faintly on a porcelain countertop. Behind it, global economic graphs spike upward like cardiac arrest. Text, "And then the yogurt took over." This isn't just animation. This is demolition of genres, of worldviews, of whatever safety net you thought storytelling had. When Love, Death, and Robots quietly dropped on Netflix in 2019, it didn't just entertain. It detonated. In just 18 bite-sized episodes, it reinvented what adult animation could be: hyperreal CG, sketchy 2D, slow burns, blunt trauma. And among these, the first 6 episodes formed a perfectly calibrated starter kit for philosophical carnage. They showed us how trauma can become weaponized, Sunny's Edge. How cats might outlive us all, 3 robots. How violence doesn't end, it loops, The Witness. How family farms become frontlines in a war they started, Suits. How folklore becomes farce when a monster fears a house cat, Sucker of Souls. And how maybe, just maybe, dairy is our new god when the yogurt took over. Each story works like a pressure test for the modern world. 5 minutes to build a society. 10 minutes to burn it down. What's left isn't rubble, it's a question. What will be humanity's legacy, brilliance or absurdity? Today we're peeling back each layer: visual tricks, thematic landmines, production secrets. What looks like chaos turns out to be precision-engineered commentary on everything we're afraid to admit about our world. And at the center of it all, how did a dancing cyborg, a pack of sentient cats, and a sentient dairy product manage to expose the most uncomfortable truths about human civilization? Let's go back to the beginning and find out what kind of minds decided this was how the world should end. Before it became an Emmy-winning sensation, Love, Death, and Robots was a dead idea. Or at least, a shelved one. Back in 2008, David Fincher and Tim Miller had pitched a feature-length reboot of the 1981 animated cult classic Heavy Metal, an anthology of sci-fi, erotica, and gore. Studios passed. The project bounced between Paramount, Sony, even James Cameron's circle. No one wanted to take the risk. The world, they said, wasn't ready for adult animation that didn't wear a cape or come from Pixar. Then came Netflix. A decade later, with streaming culture allowing more genre-bending freedom, Fincher and Miller reworked the project as a series of standalone shorts. Instead of chasing a single narrative arc, they pursued tone, shock, and thematic precision. Miller's animation studio Blur would serve as a creative nucleus, but each episode was outsourced to a different animation house worldwide. The result? 18 radically different visions, and in the case of episodes 1 through 6, 6 distinct arguments about what it means to be post-human. But it almost didn't look this way. Episode 1, Sunny's Edge, was originally more linear, more straightforward. Early drafts lacked the final twist, where Sunny is revealed to be the beast. That turn wasn't just dramatic flair, it was a hard pivot in theme. Instead of a trauma victim seeking revenge, Sunny became a commentary on consciousness as camouflage. The moment reframed the entire episode. Her edge wasn't just rage. It was transhumanism weaponized. For 3 robots, the humor almost didn't survive the pitch room. Netflix reportedly questioned whether a post-apocalyptic cat comedy would confuse audiences. But Miller pushed back. He believed humor was critical to giving the show emotional elasticity. The final punchline about cats having opposable thumbs wasn't just a joke. It was a thesis. Humanity's arrogance made it obsolete. The most visually experimental short, The Witness, was shaped heavily by Spanish director Alberto Mielgo, who had worked on Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse. His original pitch was a murder scene from both ends of the same timeline. Netflix was skeptical about the eroticism, the non-linear logic, the hypersexual animation style. But Mielgo insisted. He wanted discomfort, not clarity. He wanted the viewer to feel just as disoriented as the characters. And that's exactly what made the episode iconic. Other episodes faced quieter transformations. Suits was originally darker, more cynical. The final version softened the ending, emphasizing resilience and community over cosmic horror. Sucker of Souls embraced its B-movie tone only after Miller told the team, "Let it be stupid. Stupid can still be brilliant." And when the yogurt took over, That came from a short story by John Scalzi that nearly got rejected for being too silly. Turns out, that silliness hit harder than any grim allegory. Across the board, what unified these 6 stories was a total disregard for tonal consistency and a complete devotion to conceptual clarity. Each one is distilled to its thematic core: power, identity, extinction, irony. And every one of them started as a gamble. A gamble that finally paid off when Netflix realized the future of animation isn't smooth. It's jagged, fragmented, uncomfortable, and necessary. Let's start with something rarely asked of animated series. What happens when the camera itself becomes a character in the moral argument? In Sunny's Edge, the arena isn't just a battleground. It's designed like a techno-gothic chapel. The opening shot frames Sunny from above, under sterile overhead light, surrounded by structures that blend neon with the architecture of cathedrals. It doesn't just stage a fight, it invokes sacrifice, worship, and bodily destruction all at once. The beast fight becomes a liturgy of violence, and Sunny's trauma is sanctified into spectacle. When Sunny is questioned or threatened, the camera creeps in, handheld, and unstable. But when she's piloting Carnivore, we switch to full POV combat. Visually, the show primes the viewer to associate her identity with the monster long before the reveal. Her consciousness isn't transferred at the end, it's always been there. The visual cues simply waited for the audience to catch up. In The Witness, the city never holds still. Every shot is layered with motion, scrolling neon, overlapping reflections, refracted surfaces. Characters run, but so do the buildings, the lights, the sky. Director Alberto Mielgo doesn't want the viewer to find clarity. He wants the city to gaslight you. The camera shifts from handheld realism to over-animated exaggeration, glitching your spatial awareness on purpose. By the end, when the time loop is revealed, the visual language has already done the emotional looping for you. Suits uses a different trick. It presents itself like a Sunday morning cartoon about farmers in mechs. But the visual language is pure, military-industrial propaganda. First-person cockpit views, tactical HUDs, sweeping drone shots, it's not accidental. These farmers are playing Call of Duty in a cornfield. When the final shot pulls back and reveals the dome colonies, surrounded by native alien territory, the game metaphor breaks down. What looked like defense was always occupation. Character arcs across the first 6 episodes often feel incomplete on purpose. In Sucker of Souls, the only survivor who gets any arc at all is the cat. Everyone else is a stock archetype: the mercenary, the nerdy scholar, the red shirt. But the cat, little shit, is indifferent to the violence and never once panics. That detachment isn't just comic relief, it's narrative dominance. In folklore across the Middle East, black cats are guardians against evil spirits. This feline isn't just immune to the vampire, it's sacred. The joke isn't that cats are better than us. The punchline is that nature doesn't need to evolve to outlive human hubris. In 3 Robots, none of the robots grow, and that's exactly the point. They're not here to evolve, they're here to observe. Their deadpan commentary on fast food, sports, and parenting doesn't just mock human culture, it implies something more brutal, that without mortality or memory, human sentiment looks ridiculous. The robots don't mourn us. They study us like a failed experiment in self-destruction. The twist with the cats isn't just a gag. It's ecological justice served cold. Every location in the first 6 episodes doubles as ideological terrain. When the Yogurt Took Over may be the most absurd premise in the lineup, but it's the most targeted in its symbolism. Why Ohio? Because it's America's bellwether. It's where presidential elections swing. The yogurt doesn't just take power, it takes the center of the map. When it finally leaves Earth, bored of human dysfunction, the rocket launch is framed like a NASA broadcast. This isn't absurdism for its own sake. It's a quiet eulogy for governance, for collective intelligence, for democracy as we know it. None of these stories are just stories. They're diagnostic tools. They dissect our assumptions about agency, technology, sovereignty, and identity, using animation not as escapism, but as a scalpel. What makes short-form storytelling in Love, Death, and Robots so disruptive isn't just that the episodes are short. It's that they're complete, and yet strategically incomplete. Each one introduces a full moral system, dismantles it, and leaves just enough unanswered to make the viewer responsible for interpretation. This is narrative architecture built for maximum psychic friction. Take The Witness. Most audiences experience it as a pure adrenaline loop. A woman sees a murder, runs, kills her pursuer, and sees the cycle begin again. But the deeper narrative mechanic is circular causality, a story that erases the difference between witness and perpetrator. The twist isn't in the last frame. It's baked into the pacing itself. The chase is so frantic, so disorienting, that when we land back at the beginning, it doesn't feel like a reset. It feels like inevitability. This is more than style. It's temporal warfare. The structure demands that you ask not what just happened, but was it ever linear to begin with? And that's where things get uncomfortable. The woman is running from herself, or she is being pursued by her future, or neither of them exists. In academic terms, this is narratological recursion, where plot is not a line or even a circle, but a Mobius strip. And like any good Mobius structure, the audience has no clear entry or exit point. Compare that to Suits. Its story follows a classic three-act structure: setup, conflict, resolution, but subverts the emotional payoff. We expect victory. What we get is delay. The final act suggests not that the farmers have won, but that the invasion is systemic and endless. Structurally, it echoes war films like Platoon or Black Hawk Down, but with inverted moral alignment. The farmers are sympathetic, yet the story never confirms their right to occupy that land. Their heroism is staged. Their conflict a loop, just slower and more disguised than the one in The Witness. Sonny's Edge takes a different approach, misdirection via thematic layering. At first, it seems to be a simple gladiatorial revenge story. But the actual reveal, Sonny's consciousness residing inside the beast, retroactively reprograms every scene before it. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was conceptual. The narrative sleight of hand depends on you assigning humanity to the wrong body. That trick only works because the story delays key information until after you've emotionally committed. It's less a plot twist and more a revelation about your own assumptions. In Three Robots, the narrative appears linear, robot tourists wandering through ruins. But underneath that simplicity is a constant reversal of perspective. The viewer, human, is positioned as the subject being studied. The robots, emotionless yet sarcastic, aren't evolving characters, they're thematic mirrors. Every line of dialogue is observational comedy with existential weight. The absence of a climax isn't laziness, it's thesis. There's nothing left to climax. The world already ended. The humor just makes it palatable. Nowhere is this structural subversion more dramatic than in When the Yogurt Took Over. Here, the protagonist isn't even visible. The yogurt has no face, no voice, no body. It exists entirely in implication. Structurally, it's an inverse of the hero's journey. There's no call to adventure, no resistance, no transformation, only a sentient substance that solves all problems and leaves. This isn't a story in the traditional sense. It's a parable stripped of sentiment. And that's why it hits harder than any post-apocalyptic tragedy. It suggests that humanity's biggest existential threat isn't evil. It's irrelevance. Directorial influence varies, but patterns emerge. Tim Miller's episodes lean into physical intensity and sharp tonal contrast, see Sonny's Edge or Suits, while guest directors like Alberto Mielgo push abstraction and erotic surrealism. Mielgo's fingerprint is all over The Witness, the way light stutters, the digital brushstrokes visible on character skin, the way flesh and latex shimmer under panic. His animation style mimics oil, painting in motion, and the sound design reinforces that dissonance. The world looks painted but sounds real, creating a dream state where violence feels both hyperreal and symbolic. Among scholars and critics, the most polarizing debate is about gender coding in Sonny's Edge. Some view it as a story of feminist empowerment. Sonny refuses to be owned, commodified, or broken. Her control over carnivore becomes an allegory for reclaiming bodily autonomy after trauma. Others argue the episode replicates the very tropes it critiques: the objectified female body, the sexualized violence, the voyeurism embedded in its visuals. What's supposed to be subversion, they say, becomes repetition, just better disguised. The divide reveals a larger tension within the series. Is love, death, and robots a deconstruction of pulp sci-fi, or just a modern, higher-budget extension of it? Is it parodying exploitation, or perpetuating it under the cover of sophistication? This debate extends to Sucker of Souls, which some critics dismiss as juvenile gore comedy, while others defend as a deliberate throwback to 1980s horror pulp. The cat, they argue, isn't just a gag. It's a recursive totem, a stand-in for ancient knowledge that predates man, myth, and even script. In folklore terms, the cat is the deus ex machina. In modern terms, it's just tired of our shit. If there's one thing the show consistently avoids, it's moral closure. None of the episodes resolve in a way that confirms comfort. Characters survive or die or loop, but they rarely grow. Because growth isn't the point. Exposure is. Each short drops the viewer into a world already spinning out of control, gives you one ethical choice or blind spot, then ejects you before the consequences settle. That's not lazy storytelling. That's precision discomfort. Behind the monsters, the mechs, and the metaphors, the early episodes of Love, Death, and Robots operate as allegories for systems in collapse, economic, ecological, emotional. What at first glance seems like a series of high-concept curiosities quickly reveals itself to be a report from the inside of a broken machine. In Sunny's Edge, the real enemy isn't the monster in the ring. It's the institution that created the ring in the first place. The entire underground fight culture is a thinly veiled metaphor for commodified trauma, an ecosystem where suffering is monetized, spectacle is currency, and identity is just another layer of costume. Sunny's physical scars are not just backstory. They are data points in a world where victimhood can be repackaged as entertainment. And her choice to live inside the beast, rather than within her own human body, isn't just a plot twist, it's a moral rejection of human society itself. She doesn't want to reclaim her humanity. She wants out. This is a story where integration isn't healing, it's surrender. Sunny's victory is not survival. It's defection. That same moral calculus plays out in Suits, but with different stakes. The farmers aren't just battling aliens, they're upholding a colonial illusion. Their homes, their values, their land, all built atop someone else's ruins. The aliens never attack first. They react. Yet the farmers believe they are the victims. It's a perfect portrait of settler psychology, defensive aggression fueled by inherited entitlement. Jake's sacrifice near the end is framed as heroic, but what's he really dying for? The right to defend a perimeter that never belonged to him? A system that conscripts love and community into the logic of conquest? The tragedy isn't that the aliens keep coming. It's that the humans still believe they're protecting something pure. Even in 3 Robots, the political backdrop is unmistakable. The robots are walking through the ruins of late-stage capitalism, abandoned fast food chains, gyms built on body image obsession, living rooms cluttered with obsolete tech. The human world they explore wasn't destroyed by war or alien invasion. It collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Their journey through the ruins is less tourism, more forensic audit. Every joke about basketball or parenting is a post-mortem on misaligned priorities. And the cats? They're not the punchline. They're the replacement. The species that never asked to rule, but inherited the throne anyway. The Witness, though surreal in tone, is perhaps the most psychologically precise. The loop isn't just structural, it's behavioral. It's trauma reenacted endlessly, without resolution. The woman doesn't just flee danger. She flees the memory of danger, the echo of a violation. And every time she reaches what seems like safety, she realizes she's back where she started. This is what trauma often feels like: circular, disorienting, self-confirming. And by making the loop literal, the episode externalizes what many people experience internally every day. The character's choices, run, hide, fight, are never wrong. But they're never enough. Because the system she's in doesn't allow escape. It only allows repetition. Sucker of Souls appears at first to be a tonal outlier, a horror comedy about ancient vampires and swearing mercenaries. But underneath the pulp aesthetics is a very modern allegory about extraction and desecration. The archaeologists and soldiers disturb a tomb, driven by curiosity or greed, and unleash a force beyond comprehension. They don't respect the boundary. They cross it. And they pay. The creature they awaken is more than a monster. It's the past unburied. The sins of empires, the trauma of conquest, the ghosts that were supposed to stay buried in footnotes. And fact that their only defense is a cat, an animal often associated with the divine feminine, with mystery, with independence, isn't a joke. It's a reversal. The tools of dominance, guns, maps, torches, fail. Only the sacred, the absurd, the unpredictable can fend off what's coming. When the Yogurt Took Over might be the shortest of the 6, but it delivers the most condensed systemic critique. The yogurt doesn't rise to power by violence. It does so through competence. That's what makes it terrifying. It fixes the economy, eliminates conflict, streamlines energy. And in return, it demands control, not out of malice, but because it knows better. The human response is telling. Instead of learning from the yogurt or collaborating, humanity either submits or resents. And when the yogurt finally leaves, when the most rational, benevolent intelligence decides that human dysfunction is not worth the effort, it's not portrayed as a tragedy. It's a punchline, but the bitterness lingers. This is perhaps the most cynical story of them all. Not because yogurt rules the world, but because it chooses to leave. It doesn't seek dominance. It seeks distance. And what does that say about us? These 6 episodes don't offer comfort. They offer recognition. In each case, characters are presented with systems that do not love them, do not remember them, and will not change for them. Their choices matter, but only within the confines of a game that was rigged before they entered. They are not being asked to rebel. They are being asked to adapt. And the show keeps asking us, at what point does adaptation become complicity? That's the quiet violence of love, death, and robots. It seduces you with tech and spectacle, then quietly whispers. If you were in their place, what would you do differently? And are you sure you're not already there? The first 6 episodes of Love, Death, and Robots don't just depict broken worlds. They provoke broken reactions. Their influence isn't measured by Rotten Tomatoes scores or Reddit threads. It's measured by how many people argue over whether they should even exist in the first place. When Sunny's Edge premiered, a wave of online debate erupted around its explicit violence and sexual undertones. Was it a story of empowerment through trauma? Or exploitation masquerading as subversion? Feminist critics split sharply. Some saw Sunny's decision to abandon her body and live as a beast as a radical refusal of the male gaze. Others saw it as yet another example of a violated female body being used to decorate a revenge fantasy designed for male audiences. What was supposed to be a turning point in speculative storytelling became a litmus test for how we process female agency in science fiction. The question wasn't whether Sunny had power. It was who gave her that power and who is being entertained by it. This discomfort wasn't limited to gender. In Suits, viewers found themselves rooting for homesteading mech pilots until the final shot reframed them as colonial invaders. Some audiences never forgave the show for what they perceived as a betrayal. Others praised it as one of the smartest reversals in modern genre fiction. The episode became a case study in viewer empathy, how quickly we align with a protagonist and how reluctantly we examine what that alignment says about us. This tension is especially apparent in fan forums, where debates often collapse into binary logic: heroes versus monsters, humans versus aliens. But Suits asks something harder. What happens when you realize you're the monster? The Witness generated perhaps the most divided emotional responses. Some viewers were captivated by its stylized animation and surreal eroticism. Others dismissed it as style over substance, even as it stirred discussions in academic circles about trauma, voyeurism, and the psychological architecture of infinite loops. There were essays comparing it to Vertigo, others invoking La Jetée, and still more that rejected it entirely, accusing it of glamorizing a woman's fear. The polarization was less about the plot than the feeling the episode created, a helpless, circular panic. And how audiences respond to that discomfort often reveals more about their own thresholds for ambiguity than about the episode itself. Meanwhile, 3 Robots became a social media darling. Its humor, brevity, and digestible satire made it meme-worthy, widely shared, and largely uncontroversial, until it wasn't. Environmental critics pointed out how the episode flattens complex climate dynamics into punchlines. Tech skeptics questioned whether the robot's detachment was just another way to offload human accountability onto fictional AI. In classrooms and conferences, the episode became a tool, a way to talk about post-humanism, ecological failure, and the absurdity of legacy systems. But in popular culture, it was boiled down to cat jokes and humans suck t-shirts. The question then emerged, can satire survive virality? Sucker of Souls, with its irreverent tone and cartoon violence, was quickly dismissed by some as filler. But others saw in it a cultural reckoning, the colonial arrogance of digging where one shouldn't, the unexpected sacredness of animals, the unreliability of Western logic when confronted with ancient chaos. The cat once again became a lightning rod. Some viewers read it as parody. Others called it the only divine figure in the show's lineup. A character who neither fights nor speaks, yet determines survival through presence alone. The idea that salvation could come from something uninterested in dominance cut sharply against traditional action narratives, and that unsettled people. And then there was When the Yogurt Took Over. At first dismissed as a joke, it slowly morphed into something more sinister in retrospect. After COVID, after inflation spikes, after AI systems began drafting laws and generating policy papers, the idea of a benevolent, non-human intelligence running the world didn't feel so hypothetical anymore. Public reaction to the episode shifted. Some began citing it in tech ethics panels. Others used it to explain the dangers of competence without compassion. And in private corners of online discourse, a darker question emerged. What if the yogurt was right? Across all 6 episodes, the central emotional axis isn't awe, it's disorientation. Viewers aren't comforted. They're destabilized. Every character who appears to be in control is ultimately exposed as a pawn. Every system that seems fair turns out to be predatory. Every resolution is temporary, and every moral line is negotiable. This erosion of ethical clarity isn't accidental. It's intentional. The series repeatedly places characters in no-win situations. Sonny must choose between truth and survival. The farmer must destroy his own home to stop an invasion he may have caused. A terrified woman must kill to escape, only to realize there is no escape. And viewers are implicated. The show doesn't offer solutions. It offers mirrors. It's worth asking, then, who is accountable for the tragedies in these stories? In Sonny's Edge, is it the men who tried to exploit her or the world that monetized her pain to begin with? In Suits, is it the DBs for fighting back or the settlers for building fences around stolen land? In The Witness, is it the killer or the architecture that traps them both? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're indictments. Love, Death, and Robots doesn't suggest that evil is dramatic. It suggests that evil is banal, systemic, bureaucratic, and that we often participate without realizing it. The farmers fix their fences. The robots laugh at humans. The yogurt leaves. And in all cases, the audience is left with the same uneasy feeling. We recognize this world. Not because it looks like ours, but because it behaves like ours. The rules are the same. The silence is the same. The broken logic is the same. That's the legacy of these episodes, not what they show, but what they allow us to notice once they end. The worlds imagined in Love, Death, and Robots don't belong to the future. They belong to the present, distorted, refracted, intensified, but unmistakably familiar. Each of the first 6 episodes operates less as fiction than as a speculative lens held up to emerging realities. What once felt like sci-fi now reads like a draft of tomorrow's headlines. Sonny's Edge is not just a fantasy about bioengineered monsters and neural links. It's a parable about the commodification of trauma in digital ecosystems. In 2025, we already live in a world where pain performs on social media, on streaming platforms, in virtual arenas. Trauma becomes currency. Identity becomes interface. Look closely, the fight Sonny engages in his pay-per-view content. Her abuse history is part of her market value. The spectators aren't just watching violence, they're watching a narrative, a brand, a persona. That's not science fiction. That's influencer culture under capitalist extremity. Deepfake porn, virtual combat sports, therapeutic oversharing, all of it points to a future where the human soul is monetized frame by frame. The idea that Sonny would choose to upload her mind into a non-human vessel isn't a power fantasy, it's a retreat. In tech terms, it's a full-stack migration. Abandon the vulnerable, modifiable front end, the body, and shift to a back end where autonomy can finally exist. The episode anticipates a transhumanist dilemma we're only just beginning to face. If safety and selfhood are incompatible in physical form, will consciousness one day flee the flesh altogether? 3 Robots offers no such escape. Its satire points not toward transcendence, but collapse. The episode walks through the graveyard of our present systems, fast food, consumer electronics, nuclear armament, and shows what they will look like once they outlive us. Nothing in the episode is exaggerated. Surveillance culture, brand loyalty, disposable labor, these are not predictions. They are autopsies. The only real joke is that it takes robots, not humans, to finally articulate how absurd the human experiment was. Even their deadpan tone mirrors how we already talk about our own downfall. Climate doom has become a meme. Mass extinction is TikTok fodder. Irony is the only language left that feels emotionally safe. But the cat is what seals the commentary. Evolution didn't choose the strongest or smartest to replace us. It chose the most adaptable. The cat, unaffiliated with ideology or infrastructure, simply endured. In an age where billionaires want to upload themselves into space servers and blockchain immortality, the cat reminds us, resilience isn't advanced. It's elemental. In The Witness, The looping narrative structure parallels not just trauma, but algorithmic repetition. We live in cycles too. Click, swipe, scroll, rage, click again. The episode doesn't just depict a woman trapped in a loop. It describes the emotional architecture of content addiction. You saw something. You reacted. You panicked. You thought it was over. You looked again. It begins again. This isn't abstract. Machine learning systems already decide what we see and when based on behaviors we can't track in ourselves. Attention becomes surveillance. And once the loop starts, we don't break it. We optimize it. In this sense, the murderer and the witness aren't just characters, they're nodes in a feedback loop. The system doesn't care who's right or wrong. It cares that the chase continues, that there's movement, engagement, return. The loop is the product, and we are its labor. Suits extrapolates another modern pathology, the rural militarization of imagined threats. The visual language of the episode, mech suits, homestead pride, patriotic sacrifice, feels almost nostalgic until you realize who the farmers are fighting. Indigenous life. Life that never invited them. Life they call bugs to avoid calling them neighbors. It's not hard to see the real-world parallel. Settler colonialism, national security panic, the myth of the righteous homeowner with a gun. In America, this isn't sci-fi. It's cable news. The right to defend what was taken. The refusal to ask where the threat came from. The episode's refusal to fully villainize the farmers mirrors our own discomfort with nuance. We want to root for the defenders. But the wide shot at the end, the one that shows the humans as just another infestation on a colonized planet, asks a deeper question. What if every home we protect was built on a war we chose to forget? Sucker of Souls plays with this idea through myth instead of military. The team of archaeologists and mercenaries doesn't just stumble into danger. They unearth it. And in doing so, they reenact the entire history of Western knowledge projects. Extract, classify, publish, escape. But this time, the past doesn't stay silent. The vampire is less a character than a metaphor for retribution. It's a being that feeds on arrogance, punishes curiosity, and fears the one creature that won't perform submission, the cat. The cat in this episode, once again, becomes a countersymbol. Not domesticity, but boundary. Something that refuses to obey, that lives beside history, not in it. In real-world terms, Sucker of Souls can be read as a warning about cultural desecration, of sacred lands, of ancient knowledge systems, of stories that weren't ours to tell. And its comedy doesn't undercut that point. It delivers it. The laughter is nervous. It's the sound of Western hubris finally hitting a wall. When the yogurt took over, wraps these anxieties in a smile. It presents a world where humanity finally solves its problems by handing over power to something else entirely. Not a dictator, not a machine, a dairy product, sentient, efficient, and completely uninterested in our feelings. This is not absurdism. It's systemic realism in disguise. Look around. AI writes copy. Predictive policing decides who gets arrested. Algorithmic trading crashes economies. We have already outsourced reason. The only thing left is willpower. And the show asks, what happens when even that isn't trusted? The yogurt doesn't want to enslave humanity. It just wants quiet. It wants results. And when the humans begin to bristle under its hypercompetence, it leaves. Not in fury, but in disappointment. That's the harshest judgment of all. This resonates in our current moment. Techno-solutionism dominates public discourse. We want problems solved without pain, without politics, without reflection. We want utopia as a service. But love, death, and robots reminds us, intelligence isn't justice. Efficiency isn't empathy. And the future won't wait for us to deserve it. The series does not argue that we're doomed. It argues that we're misreading the terms of survival. It's not about who builds the best weapon, who controls the narrative, who engineers the tightest algorithm. It's about who understands the limits of control itself. And here lies the show's most prophetic insight, the end of human centrality. Not apocalypse. Not extinction, just irrelevance. Worlds that continue without us. Systems that no longer require our approval. Evolution that doesn't remember our names. What began as an anthology of experimental shorts becomes, by episode 6, a philosophy. This isn't your story anymore. After the episodes aired, their cultural life didn't end. It mutated, fragmented, and in some ways became even more volatile than the stories themselves. Love, Death, and Robots didn't just influence animation, it changed how speculative fiction is talked about online, studied in classrooms, and memed in places that often ignore anything without capes or franchises. Three Robots quickly escaped its narrative boundaries. The sarcastic AI trio became Reddit avatars, TikTok soundbites, even university case studies on post-human ethics. One viral meme replaced traditional family tree templates with flowcharts titled, "What Would the Robots Say About You?" Another featured the cat from the episode holding a clipboard that reads, "Opposable thumbs confirmed." It was funny, until it wasn't. Educators began incorporating the episode into climate ethics courses. AI ethicists cited it as a visual shorthand for technological nihilism. A Stanford seminar titled after the Anthropocene, Humor and Ruins featured it in its syllabus. But perhaps the most unexpected legacy came from when the yogurt took over. Originally dismissed as comic relief, it gained traction in political philosophy circles after being used in a Princeton lecture about benevolent authoritarianism. More provocatively, a 2023 think tank white paper about AI governance models quoted the episode's final line in its abstract. And then the yogurt left. Fan culture also responded, but unevenly. While The Witness sparked extensive visual fan art and tribute animations, it also became a lightning rod in feminist and queer theory debates. Online zines like Soft Apocalypse and Gender at Frame 24 dissected the chase loop as a metaphor for queer erasure and trauma repetition. The episode's unresolved structure became, ironically, the perfect allegory for unresolved discourse. Panels and threads loop 2. Desire, panic, deletion, recontextualization, repeat. Suits, meanwhile, inspired less academic conversation and more subcultural appropriation. Gun culture forums in the U.S. lifted mech suit stills and modified them into Second Amendment patriot memes, sometimes removing the final wide shot that implies settler colonialism. On the other end of the spectrum, indigenous artists reworked the same episode to tell stories about environmental defense and ancestral reclamation, with the aliens recast as land spirits rather than threats. This duality is telling. The series doesn't dictate interpretation. It provokes reinterpretation. And that's why it endures.